Welcome to Safe on Deck. Episode 28 is part 2 of my interview with Col Joe Kinego. After earning his wings at Reese Air Force Base in Texas, Col Kinego was assigned to the 3640th Pilot Training Wing at Laredo Air Force Base in Texas, where he instructed in the T-38 Talon. Col Kinego then trained to fly the B-57 Canberra, where he qualified as combat ready just as the bomber was being withdrawn from service in Vietnam. Col Kinego was then assigned to Shaw Air Force Base in South Carolina, where he trained to fly the RF-4C Phantom II. Following his RF-4 checkout, Col Kinego was assigned to the 14th Tactical Reconnaissance Squadron based at Udorn Royal Thai Airbase in Thailand, where he flew 148 combat missions and over 400 hours in combat, earning him the Distinguished Flying Cross. The completion of his year-long tour in Southeast Asia, Col Kinego was handpicked to fly the legendary SR-71 Blackbird. Col Kinego flew 110 Cold War missions at speeds above Mach 3 and altitudes above 80,000 feet, providing crucial intelligence on the Soviet Union, China, North Korea, North Vietnam, and Cuba. Col Kinego became an instructor pilot in the SR-71 and the lead standardization and evaluation pilot for the wing, and he is one of only a handful of SR-71 pilots to accrue over 900 hours flying the jet, including time in the A, B, and C models. Next, Col Kinego served in a variety of Blackbird assignments, including Chief of the SR-71 Reconnaissance Branch and Commander of the 1st Strategic Reconnaissance Squadron, the Air Force's only SR-71 squadron. Following his time flying the Blackbird, Col Kinego went on to serve in a variety of high-profile leadership roles within the Air Force, including as wing commander of the 319th Bomb Wing at Grand Forks Air Force Base in North Dakota. He was responsible for a fleet of B-1B Lancer bombers and KC-135 Stratotanker refueling aircraft. While at Grand Forks, he oversaw the safe termination of the wing's nuclear alert commitment at the end of Strategic Air Command's nuclear alert posture. Col Kinego retired from the Air Force in 1994, capping off a distinguished 27-year career. The colonel was a command pilot with over 4,500 hours in the T-38, B-57, RF-4C, SR-71, B-1B, KC-135, and EC-135 aircraft. Next, Col Kinego joined TASC, a defense contractor, providing technology and operational support to the Department of Defense and civilian agencies, including the CIA, NSA, and DIA. After retiring from the private sector, Col Kinego became a docent at the National Naval Aviation Museum, located aboard Naval Air Station Pensacola, where he's one of only 2 Air Force aviators leading public tours through the museum, sharing the storied history of naval aviation. Thanks for taking the time to listen. In the future, I plan to continue to share similar interviews with both current and retired military aviators. If you have a question or a suggestion for a future interview, please leave it as a comment below. Safe on Deck, Episode 28, Part 2, with Col Joe Kinego. Enjoy. So I think one of the most commonly asked questions, because the airplane is so interesting and the performance envelope is so large, how fast, how slow, how high, how low? Let's just talk about the corners of the envelope for the SR-71.
Okay. Of course, it was an airplane that was made and designed to go high and fast, and that's most of the parameters. So our max speed in the SR-71 was 3.2 Mach was normal, over 3 times speed of sound. We could go to 3.3 Mach with approval. So how fast did I go? I went 3.3, probably about 3.31, 3.32. Takes you up to the maximum ceiling on the airplane is designed to be 85,000 feet. And most of us got above that just because when you're flying in cold temperatures at high altitude, the airplane wants to climb. So my highest was probably in the 87,000 feet range. Interesting story we tell when you try to talk about the speed of the airplane. I mean, how fast is 3.2 Mach? It's 21 or 2,200 miles an hour, depending on temperatures and air density. It's about 36 miles a minute. But when you put it into terms that people can understand and kind of fun, is if you were to shoot a 30-06 bullet from Los Angeles to New York City, and that bullet could maintain its muzzle velocity the whole way, and if you were to fly the SR-71 along that same route, we would beat the bullet by about 5 minutes. So that's how fast the airplane goes. As far as slow, we never went slow. So, the airplane had no flaps, no slats, no speed brakes. You didn't fly it slow. We cruised around at 0.9 Mach, basically, to go to the tanker and subsonic. And then after that, we accelerated. And coming off the tanker, we refueled about 25,000 feet. Full tanks in an SR-71 is about 80,000 pounds of gas. And we would start our acceleration and climb. It took about 22 minutes to reach, say, 76,000 feet and Mach 3. We used about a third of our fuel doing that. And then once we leveled off and started cruising, we would generally let the airplane cruise climb as it got lighter. Now, if we were flying an operational mission and we had to be at 78,000 feet or some specific altitude because of any threats along the way, then we would adjust that accordingly. But a normal mission leveled off at Mach 3 at about 75,000 and cruise climbed up towards 80,000 feet. The highest I've been on an operational mission was about 84,500 feet, and that was over Hanoi in Vietnam, flying those particular missions.
Could we talk a little bit more about those? And I remember you mentioned earlier that was your first operational mission in the Black Jet, was going over Hanoi. Was it a routine thing that was done? Was it something that imagery was desired at a routine basis, or just whenever it was called for by the National Command Authority?
Well, it was whenever it was called for from the National Command Authority, but our missions over Hanoi were dual purpose. It was to look for North Vietnamese troop locations and surface-to-air missile sites, but it was also very important to give the prisoners of war in Hanoi, Hilton, and other places that double sonic boom that the SR-71 has, that everybody knew, just to let them know they hadn't been forgotten, because we stopped bombing up north in, I think, sometime in 1973. So there weren't any airplanes up there. So the SR-71 was basically the lone airplane that would let them know we were still there.
I don't think pilots always necessarily talk about their feelings. We talk about performance and numbers and like to quantify things in a very technical way. But what was your feeling and the feeling of you and the other crews when you were doing that? I mean, you were speaking to your fellow aviators on the ground in a way that no one else can and no one else probably ever will since that happened. What was the feeling among the crews? Were you proud to be doing that, I would imagine, proud to be watching over them? Very
proud to be doing that. Now, I will tell you, my first mission, I was the spare aircraft. I think we discussed that. So we were sitting in the hangar, and we knew it was a North Vietnam mission. We knew we were going over Hanoi. We did not know all the reasons why. We just assumed we were going over to take pictures and collect intelligence. It wasn't until we got back that we found out that it was that important of a mission for the POWs, which is why the mission was spared. Most missions weren't spared. If it didn't go, it didn't go. But this particular mission and the others that we flew over North Vietnam for the POWs were spared missions, so we could go. And to answer the other part of your question, yeah, once we found out, we were very proud, very proud. And I think I might have mentioned that years after that, when we would take the SR-71 to static displays and to air shows at different bases, you go to the officers' club, if there were any POWs in there, some of them did actually mention hearing those double sonic booms. And as much as it could make them feel good at the time under the conditions they were in, they did like knowing that they had not been forgotten.
That's wonderful. You mentioned showing the airplane off, bringing it to air shows. Possibly the most classified airplane in the world, I would guess, at one time. And then now it was being shown to the American public, and even in other countries, in Holland and all over the world, it seems at some point the airplane was displayed to the public. What was it like showing the airplane to folks?
Oh, it was great. We started, I can't remember exactly when we started, but I know my first air show was 1976 as part of the bicentennial of the United States. We went to Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, D.C., and that may have been the first one, but there might have been a couple before that where we did static displays. But the public was just absolutely fantastic. We had our flight suits on, and we stood in front of the airplane, and we could answer many questions we couldn't answer, of course. Where do you fly at that time? How high does it go? How fast does it go? But just for people to see the airplane, it was amazing, and we drew some tremendous crowds. It was kind of interesting. When we started going on static displays, because we were Air Force, if the Thunderbirds were there, they always put us in the same area where the Thunderbirds were, and they had all their jets lined up, and the guys were lined up in their blue flight suits out in front, but we had the bigger crowds. And the Thunderbirds used to give us some grief about that, because we were kind of stole the show for a while there until people got used to it. But it was a great airplane. And what we would do is when we flew, we usually brought 2 crews. Of course, we had to bring tankers and maintenance. It was a big deal to go to a static display. One crew flew the airplane in and generally came in on a Friday and did some flybys for people and everything, then landed and parked. And in Washington, I flew the airplane out, myself and my backseater, Roger Jacks. So we got in the jet, and the wing commander was there, and his last words were, be safe, but give them a good show. And so we got in the airplane, and we took off and went around and did a couple of low passes, followed by a full afterburner run, climbing up to altitude, and then we went straight to the tanker because we had used a lot of fuel.
And I'm guessing you said this is 76, so the airspace restrictions around D.C. probably a little different than they are these days.
Oh, yeah. There was no problem getting in and getting out.
Sure. Well, one of the other things in folklore about the airplane, you always see these photos with, looks like fuel was weeping from the jet, and a lot of people talk about how long the jet will elongate in flight due to the heat. I was hoping maybe you could speak about that next, what the airplane was made of, how heat affected it in flight.
Sure. Because there's a misconception there. Let's start with what the airplane's made of. The airplane was made from about 93% titanium alloy. At the time that Kelly Johnson and the Skunk Works were building the SR-71, the United States did not have enough titanium to mine to make airplanes. So they had to figure out where would this titanium come from. And it's a very interesting story. Now, keep in mind, the early airplanes were being built for and flown by the CIA. Well, the biggest producer of titanium in the day was the Soviet Union. So the CIA went over to Eastern Europe and set up a company there where they bought minerals. Of course, they had to buy more than just titanium for the show, but they bought minerals, and a lot of which was titanium. They took that titanium, sent it back to a cover company back in the United States that accepted the titanium. Then it got shipped down to Southern California, where the Skunk Works was at the time, at the Orange County Airport in that area. And they used that very titanium to make the SR-71s that then flew against the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The reason for titanium was simple, and yet it was extremely, extremely brilliant. Titanium is one of those metals. Apparently, I'm not a mineralogist or an engineer, but apparently, from what we were told, getting in training in the airplane, titanium can get very hot, which the airplane did. Then it can cool off. Then it can get hot again and cool off. And it doesn't weaken by doing that. It actually gets it a little bit stronger when it gets hot and gets cold, gets hot and gets cold. So that was the reason they wanted to use the titanium. Speaking of the heat on the airplane, we did generate a lot of heat when we flew, a lot of internal heat. And then a lot of friction heat. Even though the air is thin up there, we generate a lot of friction heat. So in the area of the cockpit where I sat, outside the airplane, it was about 450 degrees Fahrenheit. Parts of the airplane were over 3,000 degrees. General average was about 1,300 degrees Fahrenheit. It was so hot, and I was comfortable in the cockpit because you could maintain the temperature, but it was so hot that we had double panes of glass about a 1/4 inch thick with a little space in between for the canopy. I could take my hand in my pressure suit. I had a glove on, then I had the pressure suit glove. I could put it against the side of the canopy and hold it there for 7 or 8 seconds before it got hot and I had to pull it away. So that's how hot the environment was we flew in. So, going back to your question about fuel leaks and one of the misconceptions. First of all, when the SR-71 was built, there were fuel cells in the airplane. We had six fuel tanks, basically. There was a smaller one, but 6 basic fuel tanks in the airplane. No bladders. Most airplanes have a bladder in there. Well, no bladder because of the heat. They didn't want to have, the rubber would melt in there, so there was no bladder. So the airplane was sealed. The fuel tanks were sealed. So when they got hot and when they got cold and hot and cold, the sealant would break down. So it was about 100 hours in between fuel cell work on the airplane. And as they got hot and cold, that sealant would break down and the airplane would start to leak. Nitrogen was put on the airplane to keep the fuel from expanding and exploding, basically. It was nitrization process. That nitrogen actually pressed on the fuel also. So when you're sitting on the ground, it kind of pushed the fuel out. So it did leak. Now, there's great stories about how much it leaked. A normal fuel load for our takeoff was a little more than half tanks. I told you we carried 80,000 pounds of JP7. Usually they'd put in 45,000 pound fuel load for a takeoff. By the time I got out to the airplane, there was probably 43,000 pounds in there. And then by the time we took off, after starting engines and taxiing out and doing all our checks, about 40,000 pounds. So it wasn't pouring out of the airplanes. Now, the more fuel you put in, if you put in a 55 fuel load, or a 65 fuel load, which is high as we could go in crew force, you'd get more leakage because the nitrogen would push that fuel out. And then you get leak coming out the top, too. It was kind of interesting to see. So going back to your question about the airplane and how did it seal, you'll hear that the airplane grew 6 to 8 inches in flight when it got hot from all the friction and the internally generated heat. That's true, but the airplane didn't get longer. The airplane was built with expansion joints, like a bridge in the summertime in hot weather places. So as the airplane got hot, the expansion joints came together. And when they came together, it stopped the leak. So the expansion of all those expansion joints was 6 to 8 inches, but the airplane itself did not get any longer in flight. One interesting thing about the heat on the airplane, too, was a typical question is, what did we eat and drink when we flew? Well, the pressure suit helmet had a feeding port in there. It was sealed, but you could stick, like, we would carry tubes of food, or we would carry tubes of water, containers of water that had a long plastic tube on it, and we could stick that plastic tube in through that feeding port, and we could drink water, or we could drink Gatorade. I used to bring water and one great Gatorade with me, so that was good. You could use that long plastic straw, if you would, on the end of the water container to scratch your nose if you needed to, because that sometimes happens, so you could get in there and do that. And then we carried tube food that also had a smaller like straw on there, and you could carry applesauce or peas. It was basically baby food that they put in tubes that you could put in your mouth and squeeze it. Now, going back to the heat on the airplane, if you had carrots or peas or something and you wanted to warm them up, what we would do is just take them out of our pocket, hold them against the canopy for 8 or 10 seconds, and then squeeze them into our mouth, and they'd be nice and warm. And it made a difference when you flew for longer missions. If you could get a little applesauce or a little Gatorade in you, something with a little bit of a sugar content, your vision actually cleared up a little bit from all that sitting around in the airplane, your stagnant hypoxia and all the things that would happen to you. So it was actually not only nutritious for you, but it actually, I think, made you a little more alert.
On those long missions, human factors, like you said, definitely plays into it. Were there times that, I don't know if it be dehydration, maybe you haven't eaten enough? Could you really feel it at the end of those flights when you've been in the jet, in the pressure suit for a long period of time?
Oh, without a doubt. My longest mission, I think we talked about it earlier, was from Beale Air Force Base to the Barrens was 11 hours, 5 refuelings to full tanks. So you did two things. The SR-71 was a very checklist-driven airplane. When you descend and climb 5 complete times, you're kind of worn out from doing checklists. They're all challenge and response. So you could ask a question, answer a question. That's the way you ran the checklist. You always had to be alert during the climbs and the descents, because that's where you were more likely to get an unstart that we talked about, or some engine problems. It was not frequent, but that's where it's most likely going to happen. So you had to stay pretty much alert. Plus, you're sitting in the pressure suit all that time. You by the time that mission was done, you were mentally drained, and you were very tired, and your butt hurt because you were sitting in the airplane for, in this case, 11 hours. Well, actually longer than 11 hours, because the flight was just under 11 hours. You got in the airplane early and taxied back after landing. So you're probably in the airplane for a little over 12 hours.
At the end of that very, very long flight, you're going to do you're land the airplane, which I don't know why for me, just fascinating landing a Delta. It just seems like such a different lifting body than maybe a conventional airplane like the little RV that I have or a Cessna. But when you're landing that airplane, you're going to get the mains on deck, and then you're going to use your, I hope I'm not using the wrong term, drag chute. It's a parachute that comes out maybe kind of the center of the airplane between the tails, slow the airplane down. I think a lot of times I've seen video of the airplane, you'll get the nose on deck, you release the drag chute. I was hoping maybe you could speak about that, because there's so few airplanes that fly with that kind of a device, especially today.
Yeah, we would come down final approach about 175 knots. Power back. It was an airplane that glided to landing, unlike a Navy jet that you kind of crash on the deck there. The SR-71 would come down, and you flew it close to the ground, came back to idle, had the nose up, brought it up a little higher. As soon as you touched down, you lowered the nose. Didn't crash it down, but lowered the nose. And as you were lowering the nose, you put your hand up on the drag chute. It was a T-handle. Pulled that T-handle out when the nose got on the ground. The drag chute was a 38-foot drag chute. It was big. Came out from the back, and you had to take your hand, you should, take your hand immediately off the T-handle, and I would put it on the windscreen itself, so that when the drag chute came out, you got a very, it slowed you down quickly. There was a case early on in the program where the pilot had his hand on the drag chute handle, and he pushed it back in, which releases the drag chute. The airplane went off the end of the runway, and it was pretty much destroyed. So you pull the drag chute handle, let go of the handle, and then once that, then start braking.
What was that feeling like when that drag chute would come out? Was it I'm not going to say landing on an aircraft carrier, that amount of, you're not thrown forward in the straps, but it was a pretty dramatic pull?
Oh, it was pretty dramatic. You got jolted forward.
I'm going really down the rabbit hole here. Were you crosswind limited? Were there concerns if you had a crosswind and deploying
This is also interesting about the SR-71, and you bring up some great questions. Strategic Air Command and the Air Force and flying regulations are all kind of regulations for crosswinds and visibility for takeoff and landing and all that. We did not really have any of those regulations. If the tanker could get off the ground, we would go. And there was no, if I got on the runway and I could see the little blue lights on the runway and maybe see one runway light, we would go. We didn't, in fog and things like that. To go directly to your question, we were limited by about 25 knots crosswind, and that was with those big rudders, about as much rudder authority as we had. It was an airplane you landed cross-controlled, and probably most of your listeners know what that means but you'd put your rudders in and then put the stick in the other direction to keep the wings as level as possible while you're coming down final. And then just before touchdown, when you entered the ground effect, you let everything out and touch down, and then get the rudders again to maintain control on the runway. Now, I've landed mostly over in England in crosswinds stronger than 25 knots, because once you're airborne, at some point you have to come down. So you did what you had to do, but 25 knots was the written down limit. And that was a pretty good limit, because anything above 25 knots, you basically hit the rudder stops.
Well, I was going to say the rudder stops, I imagine, the F-117 specifically, another airplane that I find absolutely fascinating. I understand one of their limitations with the drag chute was the tails. it would actually potentially, when you would release it, you could sever one of the tails. And I often wondered how much the Blackbird you had, it's such a bigger airplane, and I can't imagine you'd be worried about the drag chute fouling one of your two rudders. But the other thing that I've often thought about is the tires. Those tires are living, like you talked about, in an incredibly hot environment up at altitude. I'm guessing, I'm jumping ahead here, but I'm guessing, is it nitrogen that's part of the tires pressurizing them? Because when you come back down to land, you're going to be putting a lot of energy on them, especially in this crosswind like we're talking about.
The tires are BF Goodrich tires. They're when you looked at the tires, they were a little bit silver because there was aluminum powder impregnated in the rubber to kind of make them a little bit stronger, and that helped reject some of the airplane heat, the airframe heat, and yes, they were nitrogen filled, about 450 psi.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, they did lose an airplane early on in that they brought the gear up in the landing gear area in the wing there, and the tires got so hot that they exploded. One exploded, took out hydraulic systems, and the airplane came down. So after that, they put a big a big steel bucket basically into the wheel well, so that the tire went up into the wheel well. When I was flying the airplane, I don't remember having any issues with it. 'Cause by then they had the aluminum impregnated tires. We had nitrogen, and everything was good with the tires, so didn't have any problems. But the tires and the brakes were the two, Kelly Johnson would say, weakest parts of the airplane. So that's why we basically took off or started engines with a 45,000-pound fuel load, because we didn't want to have to use the brakes too much on the ground as we were taxiing out for takeoff.
And that leads perfectly into my next question. What would an abort look like? Let's say you had to abort on takeoff. Could you just go idle brakes as required, or were you accelerating so quickly it was almost safer to get the jet airborne and then come back around? I know I'm asking a broad question, but...
Yeah, well, it depends on a lot of things.
Of course.
Depends on how fast you're going. I told you that generally an SR takeoff, you come off the brakes, light both burners. You get that double burner light where you can feel it in your rear end. One lights and the other lights. The airplane actually jerks left and right, and then you're going down the runway at about 130 knots on the runway. I started taking the slack out of the stick, and then about 160 knots. I lift the nose, kind of came up a little bit, and I established a takeoff attitude, and then just let it take off when it was ready to take off. We say about 210 knots, about 240 miles an hour. So what would an abort look like? You had a go-no distance. Once you got going about over, a couple of thousand feet down the runway, you were going to go, and then deal with whatever problem you had in the air. If you did abort, though, it was just like any airplane, throttles idle, throw the drag chute out, get on the brakes, and try to stop. Now, most of our runways were over 10,000 feet long, so we had a lot of, we had a couple of miles there to operate the airplane, basically. Once you're going, 210 miles an hour, you probably don't want to be trying to stop on the runway. You're probably going to blow your tires. So you would take off and then immediately start dumping fuel and come back around. I never actually had to do that. We didn't have anybody that really had to do that. The airplane was very, very, very easygoing and generous on the ground and on takeoff. It was the airplane ran very well.
Okay, well, you've got me two more questions just from that description there. How did you dump fuel? Where did the fuel actually come from when you dumped it on the airplane physically? Was it in the center between the engines on the exhaust? Or?
Yeah, if you walk around the back of the airplane between the two huge engines, you'll see there's a right at the very end of the airplane, there's a little opening there. That's the fuel dump. That's a fuel dump. In the cockpit, dumping was interesting because you could actually dump the SR-71 to empty fuel. So and I've had a couple of these cases where we had emergencies where we had to get on the ground, and I told Raj, okay, let's go through the fuel dump checklist and dump fuel. The last thing Roger would do then is take his grease pencil out and put a big circle on the cockpit or something to remind him that we were dumping fuel, because you didn't want to dump below 10,000 pounds if you were close to the.
But there was no protection. It wouldn't stop at a certain fuel level.
It
You
would
could
just
go right
keep going. going, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, interesting.
What about balancing fuel in the jet? I know, or at least I've read, I know nothing, I've read that a lot of times it's not like a Cessna. There's not left and right and both. You are manually balancing the fuel in the airplane. Or is that the A-12?
No, both airplanes.
Okay.
You could transfer fuel forward, like when you flew subsonic. The way you burned fuel, the CG, the center of gravity, would move aft. And it would get to an aft limit, and you had to transfer fuel forward. But you could also move fuel from tank to tank if you had to. That was a very rare situation. The airplane, once again, was made to fly fast and high and supersonic. And at that point, everything happened automatically. You didn't have to transfer. Now, if you had an emergency, you might have to transfer, but then you were probably going to come down anyway.
Talking about, again, the man-machine interface, how you interacted with the jet. I'm so fortunate the airplane I fly, the T6 now, has a 0-0 seat. 0 feet, 0 knots. You could pull the handle. You're going to, within those parameters, you're going to be okay. What was the seat that you sat on in the SR-71? What were its kind of operational envelope airspeeds?
It was a Martin Baker seat, just like you had the F4 and all. It was a 0-0 seat, just as you described. So we started inside a hangar, so you didn't want to eject in a hangar. But once you get outside the hangar, taxiing out for takeoff, your canopy was down and everything. The last thing we did before engine start was put the canopy down and make sure our helmet faceplate was down and we were breathing 100% oxygen and all that. And then we started engines and we taxied out. But once you're out of the hangar, if you had that bad of an emergency, you could pull the handle, and you in your back seat, or you had to pull your own handles, but each person could eject out of the aircraft.
Was there so we had a canopy breaker on our seat that theoretically, if for some reason the CFIS, we have a det cord on the canopy for the T6. If that wouldn't blow, the canopy breaker, which is mechanically part of the seat, would break that. There is anything that's going to break the top of an SR-71.
No, because you had metal up there.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm guessing, was the canopy explosively removed, and then obviously the seat would fire?
Yeah, it was explosively removed, and the seat would go.
Okay, that makes sense.
And it was all supposed to be sequential. Luckily, I never tested it.
Of course. That's really good. I found so many seats are so different, though. I had the opportunity to fly in a Super Hornet a couple times recently, and the harness is the same that we wear in the T6, but they had, we just have an ankle restraint. They had an ankle and the calf, and then obviously you would click into it for your seat pan and your shoulders. I'm told a lot of times you wouldn't strap yourself into the SR-71. You would sit in the seat, and the life support folks would kind of take care of the rest. Is that accurate?
Yes, we never. And as a matter of fact, we didn't call it strapping in.
Okay, maybe a different term.
We were being integrated into the aircraft. Yeah, and the life support people did that. There were 5 life support people that would suit you up in the Physiological Support Division building, PSD we called it. 2 would suit up each crew member, and then a supervisor would go back and forth and check and make sure everything was being done correctly. Then you'd have all your systems tested. You'd go out to the airplane, and when you were ready to get in the airplane, you'd walk up the steps. You'd have a life support person on each side lying there. You would sit down in the seat, and then they would integrate you in with your shoulder harnesses, make sure your seatbelt was connected properly, make sure your oxygen was hooked up, make sure everything was done properly. So one of the things we didn't talk about, we wore spurs. They were called spurs. Silver spurs that we wore at the bottom of our boots. And on the back of the spur was a little knob with a slot in it. And in the ejection seat, you could go down and you put a ball on the bottom by your foot into that hole in your stirrup, and then if you were flying with your feet on the rudders, let's say, and you had to pull the handle quickly and you didn't have time to assume the position, that would pull your feet back, so your feet would be back against the seat.
I kind of alluded to, or I mentioned the A-12, the CIA aircraft that was a predecessor to the SR-71. I'm guessing those aircraft were all gone by the time you were involved with the SR program, correct?
One thing we need to talk about quickly is that the Blackbird program that Kelly Johnson, the Skunk Works, made, there were 50 airplanes in the Blackbird program. The first 13 were A-12s made for the CIA. They were single-seat airplanes, just a pilot, They were one fuel tank less than the SR-71. They had 5 instead of 6. They only carried one sensor, and that was a camera that looked straight down back behind the pilot, where in the Air Force SR-71 version, my RSO sat, Roger Jacks. So they had a little lighter, they got the altitude a little faster, but there were 13 of them. Then there were 2 variants that were being made also. There were the 3 YF-12 interceptors that were made for high-altitude intercepting of Soviet bombers coming in. The threat never materialized, so those airplanes didn't become operational. There were 3 of those. One of those was lost. A missile actually hit the airplane. And there were 2 MD-21 airplanes that were variants of the A-12 airplane, and they were mother-daughter. Mother was the airplane, daughter was a Mach 3 drone. They lost one of those airplanes also when the drone actually hit the tail on the airplane, so that never was made operational. And then you got to the SR-71, and we had 32 SR-71s that were made. So now that's 50 airplanes, 13 A-12s, 5 variants off the A-12, and then 32 SR-71s. The A-12 was the first airplane to go operational. It first flew in April of 1962. It was delivered to the CIA in 1964, and it went over to Okinawa, and it operated for a year over there between May of 67 and May of 68. Approximately. It flew, I believe, 29 sorties over North Korea and North Vietnam before it was replaced by the SR-71 in 1968. So its longevity, even though it was the first airplane, its operational longevity was only 1 year. So why did the SR-71 replace the A-12? Probably a lot of reasons. But I think the main reason was the A-12 had a single camera. The SR-71 was what we call a multi-int airplane, int standing for intelligence. And so we carried a big camera in the nose that could take pictures of 100,000 square miles an hour. We had 2 side-looking technical objective cameras that had 6-inch resolution. And what that means is that anything on the ground that's like people 6 inches apart, you can count the number of people. This was the camera where on the green you could actually see a golf ball if it was on the green. You couldn't see it in the rough. You could see it on the green. And then we had electrical intelligence that we carried also on the aircraft. So we were a multi-intelligence airplane. 2 seats because a lot of work had to be done. I told you the reconnaissance systems officer was responsible for making sure all those sensors were working properly, coming on and off at the right time, pointing at the right angles, made sure our defensive systems were working properly, and also making sure that our navigation system was working properly and we were exactly where we were supposed to be. I think those are the reasons that the SR-71 eventually took over for the A-12. Now, interestingly enough, a question that's asked is, how many airplanes did we lose from the Blackbird family of airplanes? 50 were made. We lost 19. So basically 40% of the fleet, 39% of the fleet were lost. And it was basically the same across the board between the SRs. The SRs, you had 32 built, 12 were lost. The A-12, you had 13 built, 5 were lost. The YF-12 Interceptor, 3 and 1 was lost, and then the MD-21, 2 and 1 was lost. So when you put it all together, you got 50 airplanes, 19 losses. And all the losses none of them were due to aircraft fire from enemy systems at all. They all were lost, basically, how you lose airplanes. SR-71 was the last airplane built purely with slide rules, built before computer technology was used to build airplanes. Also, the way we navigated was with an astro-inertial navigation system. The astro-inertial navigation system, once again, before GPS, because of where we flew and what we had, we flew for 6 presidents, and we had to promise those presidents that we would not embarrass the United States. So the astro-inertial navigation system, the ground crew would put a navigation tape in the airplane, and it was a star date, kind of like Star Trek. It was a star date. Star date, I'm going to make this up, 182 maybe was July 15th that year. So you put a star date in the airplane in the star tracking system, and the airplane knew then which stars to look for and where they should be. When we taxied out of the hangar, if the weather was clear, the RSO would turn the astro-inertial navigation system on, and it would look for 3 stars that it was programmed to look for. When it found those 3 stars, you would get a starlight in the cockpit, which was a star. I'd get it in the front seat, Roger would get it in the back seat. We have a starlight that the navigation system was locked on to those 3 stars. Then it guaranteed you that if you were flying Mach 3, Mach 3.2, 85,000 feet, that you would be no more than 300 feet either side of the centerline track you were supposed to be flying on. Now, that's pretty amazing. That's before GPS. Getting back to the ANS, the last thing that the reconnaissance systems officer did before you went into denied territory or restricted area or in our target area was to take a fix to see exactly where we were, to make sure we were supposed to be. He could do it using our side-looking radar, or he could do it if the weather was clear using a view sight he had looking straight down through the center of the airplane. We flew one mission over Korea, and Roger's last check was a little island of Jeju-do, which is just south of Korea. He'd looked through, and we needed to be right over one tip. He looked through, and he saw something was not quite right. And this is why we were hardwired crews, I think I told you before, because we didn't have time to talk about things. Roger said to me, turn left to 180, we're aborting. And we turned left and aborted. As we were going back, we did what every crew would do at that time, and that is to get our story straight, because we were aborting an operational Cold War mission, and we had a perfectly good airplane, but Roger said we needed to abort. And I said, well, what happened? He said, we weren't exactly where we were supposed to be. I said, what looked bad? He said, we were supposed to be right over the tip of the island. He said, we were off to the side. We weren't exactly where we were supposed to be. I said, okay, great. So that was our story, and we were going to stick to it. We landed and told everybody that's why we aborted. With a little research, what they found out was the ground crew had put the wrong start date in the navigation system. It was off by 1 day, but 1 day was enough so that Roger could see the difference, and we knew we weren't where we were supposed to be, and aborted the airplane.
And that's what matters when you're flying those missions.
That's what matters, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
You talked about denied territory, and then I know the reason I kind of my next question. I know there's a lot of discussion has gone into, in some cases, and again, I'm speaking broadly here, so please correct me if I'm wrong. We're talking about Russia, we're talking about China. Certain countries we did not fly over with this airplane. Other countries, you talked about North Vietnam, you talked about Cuba. The airplane went over the mainland of those countries. We flew over that airspace, for lack of better terms. Was there ever? It wasn't at your discretion. These were decisions made way up the food chain, I'm guessing, and you were basically just told, here's the route you're going to fly. Is that an accurate statement, or was there any back and forth?
That's a very accurate statement, and we're going to talk about it later, but I found out when I was a squadron commander, I had more clearances as a crew member. As a crew member, we only had secret clearances. We weren't allowed to know a lot of what was going on in case we were captured or taken or became a prisoner. So we could actually tell the truth when we said we didn't know. Didn't know a lot of what was happening on those specific missions, yeah.
I know later in your career you went on to fly the B model of the SR-71, so we're talking about that canopy that's up a little bit higher, the cockpit that's up a little bit higher. Just kind of compare and contrast the two different airplanes, the SR-71A and the SR-71B.
I became an instructor pilot, instructing new students, and I think I told you that a new student got 5 rides in the airplane. 4 were instructional. The 5th was a little bit instructional, but it was a check ride. We wanted to make sure that he was safe to fly the airplane. So the SR-71B. Initially, there were 2 B models. One B model crashed in 1968, not long after the airplane was delivered. So there was only one B model in the fleet. And I'll explain a little bit about how we got around that. But it had an elevated rear cockpit. The rear cockpit had a full set of engine and flight controls. It pretty much mirrored the front cockpit. You did have the astro-inertial navigation system back there, which was funny because we instructor pilots, some of us knew a little bit better than others how to work that system, but that was primarily the RSO system. So just a funny side story, if I was flying an instructional sortie with a student, Roger would always, I'd get in the backseat, Roger would always come up in his flight suit, and he would lie down when I was fully integrated in the airplane, and he would set the navigation system up, tap me on the head, and he'd say, "Don't touch anything." and send me on my way. Most crews did it sort of similar to that. Others did it differently. But so you had all the controls to fly. You could not see into the front cockpit, but you were elevated, so you could see out to land the airplane. You could see out to refuel, and you could basically see out of the airplane. The SR-71B had no sensors or anything, no cameras and nothing in there. It was purely a training airplane. It flew pretty much like the A model. It was very similar to the A model. We tried to make the inlet systems, the spikes and the forward and the aft doors and the engine, and we tried to make that. The maintenance people tried to set that up so that crews would get unstarts. Not very pleasant to sit through as an instructor because you sat through a bunch yourself anyway, but you did want that pilot to get some unstarts before he was by himself getting the unstarts. So you did try to set it up to do that. I told you originally there were 2 B models and then one crash. Well, because of that, they actually made a C model. And I actually got to fly the C model a few times. It was basically what I would call a hybrid airplane. It was composed of the rear fuselage of the very first YF-12A, and then the forward fuselage of an SR-71 static test airplane. They put those airplanes together and made the C model. So it was more like an A-12. You only had 5 fuel cells rather than 6. It was a little shorter. So you got the altitude a little bit faster. You couldn't go as far. Your missions, one loop mission, instead of being 2.5 hours, was probably 2 hours and 10 or 15 minutes, those types of. So it's a little bit different that way. But it flew basically like a B model, but it was not quite as solid, not quite as solid an airplane. But I enjoyed instructing in the B model. First of all, most of the pilots were, they were all very experienced. So they were good pilots. I say most, really all. All were very experienced and very good pilots. So it was really basically just showing a new pilot the difference between the SR-71 and other airplanes he flew. He had 100 hours in the simulator before I got him in the airplane, so he knew all the procedures, knew the emergency procedures. We didn't practice emergency procedures per se. I would, on one of the landings, pull back an engine and have him go around and make a single engine approach, leave an engine in idle. I didn't shut it down. Make a single engine approach and landing, and then touch and go, and then we'd take off and go around and do some normal flights. But I would do that. I didn't pull back an engine on takeoff because the time was too valuable. You needed to get to the tanker, refuel, and go supersonic. But it was fun teaching the pilots. It was fun taking them to that speed and altitude for their first time, asking them what it felt like to them. What did they think? Here we are, you're cruising Mach 3 now. You're in an airplane, you're cruising Mach 3. And we'd always go out to 3.2, take them out to max Mach. We called it a hot leg. Mach 3 was just normal cruise. So if you say you're going to take the airplane hot, that meant you were going to go to 3.15 to 3.2 Mach.
I'm guessing it was a very small cadre, a very small amount of you that were instructors. You already mentioned a very small number of pilots just ever flew the SR, and a very small number of RSOs ever flew the SR. But I'm guessing instructor pilots, it's an even smaller group. Is that a fair statement?
Yes. We had 11 to 13 SR crews at any given time. And 3 of those crews were standardization evaluation. And we were the instructor corps, and we also gave check rides to the checked out pilots along the way, and check rides to each other.
Well, I'm jumping ahead here. Obviously, like you mentioned, as an instructor in the jet, and then later on as a squadron commander. What makes a good reconnaissance pilot? In
the RF-4, that I flew previously, you had to be able to navigate close to the ground, 500 to 1,000 feet. So you were time turns, and you had to be observant, because I think I mentioned that the photo interpreter wanted to know what you saw as much as what the cameras saw when you were flying a mission, and you had to kind of know where you were all the time as far as enemy threats and all too. For the SR-71, the backseater did all the reconnaissance work. You basically had to fly a good airplane and get the airplane to altitude and get it to the reconnaissance area. You didn't look outside and look for what did you see? You couldn't see anything. So you basically flew the airplane. So for the SR-71, you weren't really a good reconnaissance pilot. You were a good pilot getting the airplane where it needed to be.
You competitively selected from literally the best folks in the world to fly this airplane. Were there folks that maybe had trouble transitioning to that mindset, or was it a challenge, or was it something that these people took too well because they knew the shoes that they were stepping into?
The SR-71 was a different program in that if we had to let a pilot go, there were no repercussions. Most airplanes, if a pilot got let go, he had to meet a board to see if he was still qualified to fly and all, but not true in the SR-71. Unless, of course, there was something really dangerous going on. But generally speaking, no. There were a couple of occasions where really good pilots got into the program and they were uncomfortable flying the airplane. And they just were uncomfortable. And so, yeah, there were a couple that we had to let go. It was very sad to do that because they were all good guys. They were all good pilots. It was very rare. But, not scared, couldn't fly the airplane, just not comfortable in the airplane. And that made the RSO not comfortable in the back and just some problems. So
Of course.
So there were a couple like that, yeah.
One of the things I think the SR crews are so well known for is the HABU patch, H-A-B-U. I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about what that means, the significance of it, and how it tied to the SR-71.
Yeah, the HABU patch, interestingly enough, when we started flying out of Okinawa, Japan, the HABU is a pit viper. It's a cobra snake in Japan, and especially on the island of Okinawa. When the SR would fly by with that big double delta wing, the Okinawans would look up, and it looked to them like the HABU snake that they had. So they started calling it the HABU. We picked up on that to the point where when a new crew member would go over and fly his first operational sortie, like when Roger and I flew our first operational sortie over North Vietnam, when we came back and got out of our pressure suit, took a shower, put on our flight suit, on our flight suit now was a Habu patch that we didn't have before because we were now considered Habus. So the crew force would go get the new crew Habu patches and give them to them when they got back from their first flight. So the Habu doesn't stand for anything. It's strictly that snake in Okinawa.
But what a special moment. I'm sure that was a very a feeling of meaning and accomplishment. You had done something really important.
Oh yeah, it was really neat, and it was neat that the other crews would think about that also. We also, another tradition we had, not only did we get a Habu patch, but when we flew in a tie. Put a tie around our pressure suit, and when we came back, they cut the tie off, and every crew had a tie mounted on the flag, and the flag was all surrounded by all these ties.
That is so cool.
Our ties, yeah.
I would have never thought of wearing a tie with a pressure suit. That's quite the combination.
Yeah.
Jeez Louise. One of the things I did a lot in the 53, the helicopter I came from, was FCF, functional check flight. The aircraft is something, a major component has been changed. Someone's got to go out and fly it, and you follow a very specific checklist. If this is not right, you're not going to take it flying, or not even get to the next step. Was it a similar process? Did you FCF the SR-71? And then if so, was that something you ever participated in as a pilot?
We certainly did, yeah. And yes, we did. If the SR-71 was going through major maintenance, it would be transferred to Palmdale, where the Skunk Works was, and they would give us another airplane. We always had 10 SR-71s, even though they made 32 and some crashed and all, but Lockheed kept a lot of them, and then they would cycle in and out. When they came out of Palmdale, they would get an FCF down there, a functional check, with one of the Lockheed test pilots. It would come back up to Beale, and then, generally speaking, one of the more experienced pilots would fly the jet first before we would turn it over to the regular crew force to fly. Generally speaking, if it was a problem at Beale, where there was a problem and they fixed it at Beale, but it required a check flight, then usually one of the three standboard crews would fly the airplane first, and we'd put it through a functional check flight.
What was that profile like, just broadly speaking? Was it going high, going fast, or was it specific to whatever component you had changed, or maybe change an engine? You're going to be looking at very different things than maybe a flight control.
No. It was just a regular flight.
Really?
You take it out and do a regular flight. Yeah. Now, when you came back subsonic, you might do a couple of different tests on the engine or on the flight controls, or before you went out supersonic. But basically, it was a mission. It was a mission, and you went out and flew it. We didn't do stalls. We didn't do any of those types of things. So it was basically a mission. We had no subsonic flights in the airplane. I want to say with over 900 hours. Looking back, I remember I had one subsonic flight, and that was out of Mountain Home, Idaho. An airplane had lost a hydraulic system, and there had been a line that had blown up, so the airplane was a little out of sync, meaning that there were pieces missing, and they didn't want to, they couldn't fully fix the airplane at Mountain Home, Idaho. We had to get it back to Palmdale, to the Skunk Works. So we sent the crew in, myself and my backseater went in there. We got in the airplane and we flew it subsonic from Idaho to Southern California. The airplane never went, but that was the only time I ever flew it subsonic. The rest of the time, it was always just a full-blown mission. Okay,
we talked about what it's like to eat and drink in the pressure suit when you're up high, warming stuff up on the glass. But what was it just like to fly in the pressure suit in general?
That's interesting. So the pressure suit weighed about 65 pounds. And then you had the helmet and all. So it was fairly heavy, that pressure suit, when you were just moving around in it. So we didn't move around in it too much. During training, I told you we had to get 100 hours in a simulator before we could fly the airplane. During training, we would go to the physiological support division once in a while, and we would practice putting the suit on and taking the suit off and putting the suit on and taking the suit off and just seeing what that was like. one of our final training missions in the simulator before I got to go fly in the B model was a mission we flew in the pressure suit, put the pressure suit on and flew. So by the time I got into the B model, I had probably put the suit on 3 or 4 times, and I had flown in the simulator in it at least once. I think I only flew in it once, and the mission went well, so that's all I needed to do. But to go directly to your question, after about 2 to 3 times of putting the suit on and flying a mission in the B model, I was completely comfortable in the suit. It was almost like, the joke was returning to the womb. You put that suit on, we blew air by us to keep cool, so you heard that droning of air and all. It was real easy to go to sleep, not in the airplane, but if you were sitting in the chair in the vehicle taking you out to the airplane, it was real easy because it was very comfortable. What was uncomfortable were the gloves, in that they were big and you had switches and circuit breakers that were hard to maneuver. So we had a little circuit breaker instrument that had a little U shape on it, and you would actually use that to pull circuit breakers, because when the checklist called for that, because I couldn't really get my fingers around a circuit breaker. So you had to be kind of careful in the cockpit. The old ham-handed really pertained to the SR-71. So when you're going to flip a switch, you needed to be really careful that you were going to flip the correct switch, because the glove finger was much bigger than the switch itself. So, but once you got past that, it was pretty easy airplane to be comfortable in. One of the funny things we could do in the airplane, I told you we had air going through the suit to keep us cool. On those longer missions, I could close off some of the air ports in my suit, and then I could turn up the air flow, and I could actually flow my butt a little bit above the seat, so I could hover above the seat a little bit to get rid of some of that static hypoxia, and then I could let myself bend back down again and go back to normal operations. But it was a mission completion suit also. So what that meant was, remember, this was a Cold War airplane, so if you were flying a Cold War mission, heaven forbid if the balloon went up and we were flying a mission and the suit were to inflate in flight, or you were to lose pressurization, the suit was made to complete a mission. We had tabs on the suit and all. The first thing that happened is your helmet would go over your head. You had to pull your helmet back down. The suit would inflate, so you're like the Pillsbury Doughboy, but you could control that and get it in, and you could move your arms and feet just enough to fly the airplane. Now, you didn't want to do that on a training mission. And you probably didn't want to do that on a Cold War, reconnaissance mission, but it was a mission completion suit if you were on a no-kidding Cold War mission where the balloon had gone off and you had generated and were flying in a nuclear environment where you could complete the mission.
Well, speaking about the pressure suit itself, I think the David Clark Company is who manufactured those. Could you tell me a little bit about what the process was like having that suit fitted just to you, your own personal spaceship, I guess? Yeah,
I went through about 3 different variations of pressure suits when we got in the cockpit, when I got to Beale. When I first got there, the pressure suits were white. And the pilots, when I got there, were transitioning, and luckily I got a dark colored suit. Mine was actually brown. And the reason for that was, when you're sitting in the front seat of the SR-71 and you're above the atmosphere, most of the atmosphere, and the sun's behind you, if you're wearing a white pressure suit, when you look at your instruments, all you can see is yourself. I mean, that's all you can see. So the pilots, we wore different color pressure suits, but we changed that over the course of the program. But when our normal pressure suits were kind of mustard-colored pressure suits, they were David Clark suits. So yeah, you asked about getting it fit. Well, they would come to us, and they had 6 basic sizes, and then they would take those basic sizes. I think it was 6. They would take those basic sizes and then fit them to the individual that was flying in the jet. So your primary pressure suit was fitted specifically for you. Then we all had a backup suit. The backup suit was basically the closest size to you of those 6 basic sizes, yeah, and that, so you'll see some pictures where you'll see an RSO will have one mustard colored glove and one brown glove, or it's there was some kind of a malfunction.
You're not gonna order those on Amazon. This is a very specific thing.
Very specific, yeah,
yes,
very specific.
So in my little airplane, Joe, it's pretty simple. You turn a master switch on, you turn a key. Starting a Lycoming 360 is a very simple process. I get the feeling the SR-71 is probably not quite so simple. Could you talk us through what it was like to start the jet up?
Sure. There were a couple of different things that went into it. Let's talk about the fuel first, because that will explain a couple of things down the road here. The JP7 fuel that we used had a very high thermal flash point, about 3,000 degrees. We talked about it leaking out of the airplane and all. Well, it was no problem leaking. You could actually use that fuel to put out fires on the flight line if you had to. So you had to have a way to get that fuel going. The SR-71 used a chemical ignition system called triethylborane, TEB. We called it TEB. It was a pyrophoric, if you will, an oxidating agent. So when it hit oxygen, it exploded. And this TEB exploded at a high enough temperature to light the fuel off. Okay? So that was one part of the engine start. The other part was getting the engine to rotate. We did that through the Buick Wildcat engines. Our aircraft ground equipment, our aids to start the SR was called a Buick. Each of the Buick start carts had 2 Buick Wildcat engines in there. Each one was a 400 cubic inch V8 engine, and there were 2 of those in each start cart. Each one developed about 400 horsepower. And each one was mounted side by side with an automatic transmission. So as it wound up, it would keep shifting gears. They were coupled together, and then they had this vertically mounted metal shaft that came up and was inserted into the bottom starting mechanism of the engine. So the engine was physically turned by this mechanism. So each Buick ground system would start up. So when I would say to the ground crew, let's start number 2, he would start the Buick. I would take an engine, put it in idle. I'd look immediately at the RPM, and I could hear it. You'd hear this. It was like the Indianapolis 500 starting up. You'd hear these Buick Wildcat engines cranking up, and they would crank up and they would get the RPM going up, and pretty soon I'd hear this boom, because the TEB, the triethylborane, would explode when it hit oxygen. It would explode hot enough to start the engine. It would throw a big flame out the back of the engine, and then the engine would be idling. They'd disconnect the Buick quickly so it wouldn't burn up, because it would tend to burn up, and then we'd go to the next engine start.
Joe, a lot of times I'll ask folks highest high, lowest low. And for you, the highest high, literally you're almost in space. And the lowest low, I guess you're bringing the jet into land over those last couple feet of the runway. But could you kind of paint the corners of your time flying the jet? What was maybe a favorite mission, something that you look back on and then that defined your time flying the SR? And then maybe something on the other side as well, a challenge or something that was maybe something you learned a lot from as an aviator?
Well, I think my highest high was getting through training and deploying to Okinawa, Japan, and flying that first ops mission over North Vietnam. Especially when I found out that we were up there to give those POWs that double sonic boom. That was very exciting to me. Also, my first Cuban mission, I think, was probably one of my highest highs, because it was totally different, and it was something you don't get to do as an aviator very often. In that we were taken out to the airplane. It was the middle of the night. We just sat there, and when it was time, we started engines. Then we just looked at the tower. We had one of our crew members sitting in the tower with the tower controllers, and you're just sitting in there, and all of a sudden you saw a flashing green light. It meant you were cleared to taxi, and you taxied out, did all your checks, just looked at the tower and saw a flashing green light to go on the runway and just sat there on the runway and flashing green light to take off. You're not talking to anybody. We took off and flew all the way across the United States, didn't talk to anybody, descended into the Gulf of Mexico, refueled, flew our Cuban mission, and I told you about those previously, but flew that mission and then came home. And now coming home, we would talk to people again. But those two things were actually very exciting for me, and I'm not sure they defined me, but they made me I'm really proud of what I was doing and proud of the flying the missions. Also, flying the missions in the Barents Sea, looking out and seeing the contrails of the Soviet MiGs coming out of the Murmansk area, and like I said, you never saw the airplane, but you saw the contrails, and you knew they were coming up and trying to intercept. Whether it was a real intercept or just training, you didn't know, but they were trying to do it, and they just couldn't. They just couldn't do it. That was kind of that was really exciting. Lowest low, I didn't have many lows, but I would say. When I left Okinawa for the last tour coming home, I know I had flown my last operational sortie. It really kind of gets to you. I got back to Beale. I had my last flight coming up in the SR-71. Flew that last flight. Knew that it was going to be. I wouldn't be flying again. I flew a regular mission, went out, did all the things you normally do, refueled, flew Mach 3, took it out to speed, 3.2, came back in, flew some traffic patterns, and the whole crew force met me at the airplane when I taxied back in and got out of the airplane. They had champagne, and we just kind of celebrated. It was exciting, it was fun, but it was kind of sad, because I knew I was leaving the flying part of the program.
What do you miss about the SR-71?
Mostly I miss the people. I miss the, and it's not just the crew force. The crew guys were great, but the Air Force maintenance people that we were surrounded with were the cream of the crop, and those men and women just were terrific to work with. All the technical representatives, the tech reps from the different companies that maintain the navigation system, the engines, the inlets, the Skunk Works people we worked with were all terrific. And we all got very close over the course of the years I flew the airplane. And I miss seeing all them.
I can only imagine, because that tight-knit team doing something so special and so unique.
It was.
Can't be matched anywhere else.
No.
Okay, Joe, so I know you talked about, you've seen the movie, I've seen the movie, Top Gun Maverick, and we saw the SR-72, the follow-on. I'm kidding, of course, it's a movie, it's not real. Actually, you know what, before I even ask anything else, just as a movie goer, but also someone that's actually been fast in a black airplane, what did you think about the depiction of that jet? Was it at all realistic? Was it anything like you remembered, or was it pure Hollywood?
It was pretty much pure Hollywood.
Okay.
He walked out there by himself and got in the airplane and went to fly, and ended up a Mach 10, pretty much pure Hollywood.
I figured as much. Okay, well, let's talk about the real world and reality instead. In the 90s, I know the airplane went away. Actually, I don't know the exact date that it left the Air Force inventory, but I remember reading something where for Desert Storm, there was actually some talk made of, hey, let's bring the airplane back. There was even potentially a loss felt in the reconnaissance community that the SR-71 could have filled. And all I know is what I've read online, or what I've read in books. The follow-on to that airplane has been sensors. Obviously, we've got satellites up high, maybe drones or unmanned aircraft, unmanned aerial systems. But all that said, and without speaking about anything you can't, because I certainly don't know and don't want to know, but what loss did the intelligence community feel by the retirement of the airplane? Or is it something that constellation of other stuff has done more than the SR-71 ever could? In my mind, I feel like it's a huge loss, because it's an airplane that does something that no one else can do. I get it was expensive, there was a logistical footprint, all those 135s and all that intense training for you and your crews, but is it really a loss, or is it something that we've maybe made up in other ways?
I personally feel it was a loss. It was deactivated in 1990, early 1990. Because the Cold War was over. The airplane, as you said, had a large footprint. It was not cheap to fly. So the government didn't feel that it was needed anymore. Lockheed at the time was building a drone, a high altitude drone called Dark Star, and that high altitude drone was supposed to replace a lot of what the SR-71 did. However, I feel that, and I felt that at the time too, that retiring the SR right then was probably premature because we hadn't seen what the world was going to be like without the Cold War. We just assumed it was going to be good, and it didn't necessarily turn out that way. Having an SR-71 right now wouldn't be a bad deal, so we could do the reconnaissance in the Straits of Taiwan and see what's going on over there. So there's a lot of good reasons for the SR-71, but also there were a lot of good reasons why the airplane was deactivated also. So it's just a matter of give and take. By the way, the high altitude drone that was being built to replace the SR-71 Dark Star never went operational because it crashed too many times, and they just stopped making it.
Interesting. I've often hoped, and I say semi-jokingly, semi-seriously, I hope there's something waiting in the wings. I hope there's something that's in a desert hangar somewhere in Nevada maybe that will continue that legacy of greatness that I think Lockheed Martin, Skunk Works, that all those folks like you work so hard to continue. I hope there's something out there. I don't know. I have literally zero knowledge of it, but I cross my fingers, I smile, and I hope. Because
I'd like to think there was something out there. I don't know that there is. You keep hearing about hypersonic vehicles, so that's I guess that's a possibility.
For sure.
It'd be interesting to see.
One thing that you did after flying the SR-71 is you moved into a leadership role, and everything you're doing as an Air Force officer, you're be it leading other people, leading a team, but you got to move to a very special position, which was commanding an SR-71 squadron. I was wondering if maybe you could speak a little bit about that. There's a couple little data points that I know, again, from books that I've read, but I've never talked to someone that's done it. What's it like leading that squadron?
Well, there was only one SR-71 squadron in the Air Force. I was at National War College, going through a school that the service had put me through, a one-year course, and it was very interesting. The commander of the Tactical Air Command at the time, General O'Malley, came to the War College to speak. I had no idea what my assignment was leaving the War College, and people were getting assignments. I was a lieutenant colonel. I just had no idea what it was going to be. This is what I love about the program, the SR program. After his talk, he was standing by the door, and we were kind of filing out the students, shaking his hand, thanking him for coming and talking. And he looked at my name tag, and he said, "Joe." I had never met the man. He said, "Joe," he said, "congratulations on getting the squadron." That was the way I found out. General O'Malley, Jerry O'Malley, flew the very first operational SR-71 sortie out of Okinawa in March of 1968. He moved up quickly, became a four-star general, commander of the Tactical Air Command, but yet somehow, even though the SR-71 was in the Strategic Air Command, he was either involved with or somebody told him who the next commander of the squadron was going to be. That was always a good story, I thought. So what was it like? It was a real thrill. Keep in mind, I had cadets or detachments at Okinawa, Japan. I had a detachment at RAF Mildenhall in the United Kingdom. Each detachment, when I got to be the squadron commander, had 2 crews and 2 airplanes and all the maintenance personnel. Now, the maintenance personnel did not work for me, but the crews did, and everything associated with the flying operation was under the squadron and then under the detachment commander overseas. So I was in charge of responsible for the training of new crews. I was responsible for deploying crews, making sure crews were ready to go at a moment's notice. One of the interesting things we got to do, I was called one weekend after our bombers bombed Libya. The bomb damage assessment they were getting from the satellites indicated that maybe the target had been missed, and the bombers were going to have to go back again for a second run here in a few days. We were called at Beale to ask how fast we could get a couple of airplanes and crews generated, fly them over to Europe to do some bomb damage assessment of the target area. So we did that. We got a couple of crews, got a couple of airplanes ready to go, sent them overseas, and I think it was within about a day and a half, those crews flew a mission over those targets. And what we found out was the bombing was so accurate that the building collapsed. And from the bomb damage assessment done from the satellite, which was sitting quite a distance away, it almost looked like the target had been missed. So I was very excited about that because the SR-71 actually made it so that the bombers did not have to return to that target area again because they struck the target. Another thing we did, which was very interesting, we did it out of Okinawa. We sent crews to fly the Straits of Hormuz, which is the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, where the strait is there. Well, the Iranians had silkworm missiles, and our Navy had to get their ships in and out of the Gulf. And the silkworm missiles, of course, were a problem. So we flew SR-71 missions to try to get the order of battle, if you will, for the silkworm missiles, and I thought that was a very rewarding mission for us and for the other services, the Navy in this case, which was neat because the SR-71 was a Cold War airplane, but the two examples I just gave you were really tactical type reconnaissance, but from high altitude.
Was there any resistance within the Air Force for the aircraft to go from that strategic to more of a tactical mission set? Or was it something where, hey, there's good that we can do with the jet, let's go out and do it?
At my level, there was no resistance. I mean, we got an order to go do it, and we did it. And we got a call, can we do it? And we said, yes, we can do it. But if there was resistance, it was before anybody called me.
That's good to know at a higher level, perhaps, then. Or hopefully not at all, right? Everyone's on the same team.
Hopefully once you call a squadron commander, all the resistance has been taken care of.
For sure. One thing that I think is very interesting about the SR and in other aviation, in the Air Force specifically, if you're a commanding officer, you fly the jet. In the SR community, as I understand it, you do not. You might still fly. Were there T-30? Were there other? Yeah, there were T-38.
Yeah.
So you stayed current in other aircraft.
I flew the T-38. I was an instructor pilot in the T-38. I flew with all my new pilots in the T-38. But as a squadron commander, you did not fly the SR-71.
Why is that?
Because of expense. It was an expensive airplane to fly. You wanted to save the hours and all for the guys who really needed it, and that was the crew force that was in training to go overseas and fly operational missions. So that's where all the effort, where all the funding went. I had no problem with that. I got to fly the T-38 pretty much whenever I wanted to, which was 3 or 4 times a week. So that was kind of fun for me, and I got to fly with all the new pilots. So I got to see how they were doing and all in training, and so it kept me involved with everything.
Did you get to visit a lot of your crews on det in Okinawa at Minden Holland? Did you get to travel?
I did do trips over there, but we had a det commander at both places who did not work for me. The det commander worked for the program. They were Air Force colonels. They'd flown the airplanes. We were all good friends. But the crews went over there, and when the crews went over there, they worked for the det commander.
Interesting. So a little bit different. I'm thinking of the Navy construct where everyone works for the skipper, the commanding officer.
Yeah.
Here,
so when I went over to the det, my interest to the det was, am I sending you guys that are fully ready to fly the mission? How's everything working out? I would not take over the det. The det would still be det commander would still be the commander of the detachment over there. Yeah.
And that was my next question. Was going to ask your style. Did you roll in and hey, the boss is here, or you're there to? What can I do to support you? What can I do to make sure
that was it?
The best crews, the best.
What can
aircraft?
we do to support? How are the guys doing? I'd listen to the complaints some of the guys were doing this or doing that or not paying enough attention, but generally speaking, it was just to support the detachments, yes.
Makes sense. Again, I like to say highest high, lowest low. What's something you were really proud of, something really great that happened during your time as a commanding officer?
Well, I think the highest high was transitioning and flying those tactical sorties over Libya and the Straits of Hormuz and doing things like that. That was really kind of exciting for a squadron. We were very much involved in those types of things. Probably my lowest low was I actually had to relieve a pilot. In this case, unlike the example I gave you before of a pilot that was uncomfortable in the airplane and all. In this case, he was a good pilot, but he lied to me. When I took over command of the squadron, I told everybody that I would back them to the hilt, but the one thing I would not do is that one thing they should not do is lie to me. Tell me the truth and I'll back you up. In this instance, I was not told the truth, so I went up to the director for operations and the wing commander and said, hey, this is what I want to do, and they backed me. We did let the pilot go. He stayed in the operation and flew the T-38, but he never flew the SR again. That was low for me. I didn't like doing that. I didn't like having to do that.
I'm guessing that's the we in the Navy will semi-jokingly say that's what the command bonus is for. That's what you're getting paid the big bucks for, is that leadership piece of it. And that's not something that everyone always necessarily sees. That's
right. You don't people don't see that, but those are things you do as a commander. You have to it's integrity. You have to tell everybody where the limit is, and when the limit's broken, you've got to do what you got to do.
Yep, hold the standard.
In this case, it was lying.
Well, another thing I know that was probably not maybe a shining moment in your time in command was an espionage case that you worked as the commanding officer of your squadron and helped a lot of other outside entities keep the community safe, keep your pilots safe by putting someone behind bars, essentially. I was wondering maybe you could talk about that story.
Sure. It's a long story, probably a podcast in and of itself, but let me break it down. Yeah, I was told by the vice commander, second in command of the wing, when I was squadron commander. He said, "Hey Joe, I need you to come to my office tomorrow morning about 7 o'clock and bring your hat, because you won't be going to your office again after that." I thought, my golly, what could this be? So I got to the vice commander's office, and he said, Joe, you need to go over to the staff judge advocate's office. That's the lawyer on base. He said, you need to go to his office, and you've got a meeting set up over there. And I thought, wow. He said, I can't tell you what's going on, but you need to go over there. I said, okay. So I had no idea what the problem was. Everything's going through your mind. What has one of my guys done? What have I done? What's going on? So I went over to the staff judge advocate's office, and he said, Joe, and we were very good friends. He said, go sit in the outer office. He said, we'll start the meeting when the Office of Special Investigation, OSI, and the FBI get here. I thought, holy cow. Well, what it was they got there, and they brought me in and briefed me that one of my admin clerks, they said, had tried to contact the Soviet embassy in San Francisco, and with the offer to sell SR-71 secrets to the Soviets, and that they were following up on that, and that I did in fact have a possible spying incident in the squadron. I said, I can't believe that. I said, you're going to have to tell me more than that. They said, well, let us show you some pictures. So what they had done was, when this individual called the Soviet consulate in San Francisco, he actually got the call was returned by an FBI person named Ivan. And when Ivan called him back, he said, don't call us again. We'll call you. He says, well, let's set up a meeting. Well, my guy called him back again, and the FBI got really mad at him this time, and they met him in a McDonald's in the little town of Davis, California. And they had pictures of my airmen showing up, going into the McDonald's. They had pictures of him in there, and they had some sound of him trying to telling him that he was going to sell him secrets. So they said, go back and we'll contact you. Sent him back to the squadron, and then I was brought into it. And they said that they were going to set up. They had to catch him in the red-handed, trying to take the secrets out of the safe in the squadron and take them to the Soviets, who we thought were the Soviets, and they needed my help, and I said I would be happy to help, and The first thing was they needed to get into the squadron and put cameras in the walls of the squadron, and then set up a room in the building the squadron was in where they could have people in there 24/7 monitoring the cameras. I said, okay, we can do that. I said, but I don't want any of my guys caught doing something that might not be exactly 100% right. We're here to catch the spy, and that's it. And everybody agreed that was that we'd do that. Not that my guys were going to do anything wrong, but I didn't want any collateral damage. So they said the first thing we need you to do is we'll call you when it's time to come meet with us. Well, I got a call one day at home from the staff judge advocate. Like I said, a friend of mine, he says, Joe, he says, I'm going to pick you up tonight about 6 o'clock after dinner. We've got to go out and have a meeting with the OSI and the FBI. I said, okay. So I'm sitting having dinner, and beep of the horn. I tell my wife and my kids, who were in high school at the time, I said, hey, I got to go. Jim's out here, and we got to go. It's a mission. I can't really tell you anything about it. So got in the car with him. We went downtown to a hotel, normal-looking hotel, nobody parked out front. Got to a door, knocked on the door, and when the door opened, I was amazed. It must have been a conference room because there were several rooms opened up, but the room was full of people. There must have been 30 people in the room. There were tables lined up. There were schematics of the building my squadron was in, all lying on tables and everything. And what I did for the next couple hours was sit down with the FBI and the OSI and explain as good as I could, based on the schematics, what the building looked like and how they, where the empty offices were and all that. And so when they came back after that, a few days later, they said, we're going to come back now. We're going to show up at 5:30, and we're going to be dressed as civil engineers. And we want your squadron to be empty. So I had to tell all my guys around 5 o'clock, I said, okay, everybody needs to leave the squadron. We got some civil engineers coming in here to do some work. And the guys were great. They all said, well, sir, why don't you go home and we'll stay here with them? I said, no, it's all right. You got to leave and I'll stay here with them. They said, okay. So civil engineers came. They were really OSI and FBI guys. They took me with them. We'd go around the building and we'd look at different prospective places where they could set up all their equipment and everything. And when they were ready to go, that took about 2 weeks. So I spent a lot of time in closets and in empty rooms, in full uniform, wondering what's going to happen if somebody comes and opens the door and just sees me standing here. Hey, there's Colonel Kinego. What are you doing here, sir? So I did that for a couple of weeks, and they got everything set up in the squadron, the cameras and the room set up. They showed me how it all worked, and then we waited. And they also had 2 guys 24/7 in a car outside the squadron. So the whole operation was 4 people 24/7. So they had shifts, 2 outside and 2 inside the building looking at the cameras. Well, one night I got a call from the JAG saying, hey, Joe, come on over. It's going to go down tonight. And what had happened was my airman had called Ivan and said, I'm going to get the information. He went to the squadron. They had pictures of him taking the information out of the safe. And then he got down in the car. The guys that were monitoring followed him out to where they had set up a meeting in a Holiday Inn, I believe it was. They had a room set up there where the OSI and the FBI had taken out the Holiday Inn furniture and put in their own furniture that had cameras and listening devices and these sorts of things. And then they rented the room next door where they could monitor everything that was going on in there. They brought him in, sat him down, and Ivan asked him what he had for him, and as soon as he told him all the stuff that he had to give him for money, the FBI agents then broke down the door to protect Ivan's identity, and they dragged Ivan out. I'm saying all that in quotes because Ivan was really an FBI guy. They dragged Ivan out while he was screaming diplomatic immunity and all that, and got him out of there, and then brought Ott back to the spy, back to Beale Air Force Base, where I, as his squadron commander, I was still responsible for his health and well-being, even though he was trying to do irreparable damage to our program. I had to go down to the jail and make sure he was being treated properly, make sure he had everything he needed, and then charge him. Press charges. It was my job to press charges to him and tell him what he was being charged with and everything, and go back. And I went back and I called my operations officer up that night and told him I wanted to have a squadron meeting at 7 in the morning, get everybody in there that was available, because I had been absent for the previous few months, basically in and out, but basically absent a lot of the time because I was doing this other stuff and nobody in the squadron could know what was going on. So at that point, I told everybody what was going on and why I had been gone so long.
What did they think when you told them?
They were amazed because this young man was not a bad young man. Obviously he was in real life, I guess, but just generally speaking, he was a very nice, amicable guy. And he had just gotten married, felt so bad for his wife because she lost all her benefits and everything with this. We had the trial. He elected to go with a judge and not a jury for the court-martial. Elected to have a court-martial. They flew in defense, and I was the key witness for several days on the stand. I was declared a hostile witness because I was a squadron commander, I guess. So my day kind of went like this. I would get asked the question. Somebody would say, I object, because I was a hostile witness. The two lawyers would go to the judge, and then they'd all adjourn to the judge's chambers, and I'd sit on the stand. Then they'd come back out and ask me a question. So in the course of the day, I probably had 3 questions asked, but most of it was objecting and all. But I was on the stand for 2 or 3 days. And at the end, it was kind of interesting because the defense, I forget the exact amount, but the defense asked for like 7 or 8 years. The offense asked for, the prosecution asked for 20 years, and the judge gave them 25 years. So the judge gave them more than anybody asked for.
Is that, and I don't fully understand military justice, so you can just say, I don't want to be essentially tried by a jury of my peers. I can just have the judge, be the judge, jury, maybe an executioner. But is that just something that the accused is allowed to do?
Yes, exactly. I believe you can do that in civilian world too.
Really?
I think.
I wonder why you would do that instead of a jury.
I think you can. Well, if you think the judge will be be a little more lenient,
I guess that's true. I got to convince one.
Yeah.
It sounds like it went the other way in this case entirely.
It went entirely the other way. Yes.
Wow. And you said Airman Ott was the gentleman's name. And again, just to be clear, this is out there in the public sphere, as you mentioned.
Yes, it is. Bruce Ott was his name.
Yeah. Nothing secret, nothing confidential.
No, you can look at it. You can Google it.
Yeah.
Beale Air Force Base spy.
I cannot imagine when you took over in that leadership position, there were so many things, this literally national asset airplane that you were going to be managing the one squadron of. I cannot think, probably the last thing you would have thought was you would be spending so much of your time on a case like this.
Oh, yeah. I thought it was all be kind of cool things with the crew members and having fun with them and flying the T-38. And these were experienced guys. Nobody got in trouble. They were good guys. I thought, boy, this is going to be really a great 2 years. And then all of a sudden, this raised its head. And it took probably 4 to 5 months, the whole thing. It took a while.
Wow. Well, I certainly don't want to shortchange your incredible career flying the SR and then leading that squadron. But before we step away from it, Joe, anything else? Any other final thoughts on what I think is probably the most legendary airplane this country's ever produced?
I still, I see the guys quite often, and we still talk about our beautiful Blackbird and things we did in it. You just felt so. One of your highest highs, I guess, is that you always felt that you were at the tip of the spear. If something like right now, if things were going on right now, we would probably be deploying an extra airplane to the Pacific, and we'd be flying some missions. And although they wouldn't tell us exactly what the missions are for, you would know that you were at the tip of the spear because of what's going on over there between Taiwan and China and the different areas. Yeah, you'd know that's probably why you were there.
I think any other person would just end their career right there, but you didn't. You went on to do something else, I would say equally as important. But I'm hoping you could maybe talk about the B-1 and a little bit of your career after the SR.
Sure. Once again, when I was at Beale, as the squadron commander, I was getting close to 2 years in that position, and that was about, long enough, about as long as you were going to be. And I remember every once in a while I'd bring it up to the wing commander. I'd say, hey, sir, haven't heard anything yet. You have any idea where I might be going after this job? And I just took it for granted I'd probably be going to the Pentagon or something. I was still a lieutenant colonel, so I thought I'd be doing something like that. I really didn't know. I got called in by the wing commander one day, and he said, Joe, he said, I have your assignment for you. He said, but you can't tell anybody at this point. He said, you need to be quiet because I'm gonna announce it at stand up, and I just want to that be the announcement. He said, you're going to go to Ellsworth Air Force Base up in South Dakota, Rapid City, South Dakota, to be the director for operations, actually the assistant director for operations for the B-1 wing up there. I said, the B-1 wing? I said, I don't know anything about B-1s. I said, but it sounds like a great job. He said, you were specifically recommended. This goes back to doing a good job and that we talked about earlier and being a team player. He said, the wing commander up there, Buck Adams, is an SR-71 guy. He was your instructor in the SR-71 simulator, and I knew Buck very well. And he said he requested you specifically to come up there to be the ADO and then move up to be the director for operations. So I said, great. I said, I won't tell anybody. So I get back to the squadron, waiting to go to stand up, or I'm going to get told. And I get a call from my wife, who was told in the commissary that we were going to South Dakota. And I said, nobody's supposed to know that yet. She said, well, I was told in the commissary. I said, okay, good. So we go to stand up, and the wing commander makes the announcement that I'm going to South Dakota. But apparently the word had gotten out. So anyway, I did go up there.
In the Navy, we would say in the smoke pit, if you want any of the good gouge, any of the good rumors, go to the smoke pit. Someone already knows what's going to be happening 3 days from now. Just check with them.
Yeah.
Same thing here in the commissary.
Yeah,
That's
in the
fantastic.
commissary. I told my wife where we were going. But I thoroughly enjoyed the B-1. I got up there in August of 1987, stayed 3.5 years there. I got there as the assistant director of operations, lieutenant colonel. I made colonel, and I moved up to be the director for operations of the B-1 wing. We were the first operational wing to get B-1s. The first B-1s that came online stayed at Dyess Air Force Base, and that's where the training was done for the B-1s. They moved the B-1s to Ellsworth. We were the first B-1 wing to go on alert with the B-1, SAC alert, like the B-52s had been. So we were receiving B-1s when I got there. We ended up getting 35 B-1s, and when we generated the B-1s for Strategic Air Command Operational Readiness Inspection, ORI, like we were going to war, we would actually generate 28 of those B-1s. So that was always really, really interesting.
And when you mention alert, I just want to make sure that term is clear. This is with nuclear weapons. You were part of the triad that would strike back.
Right. The nuclear triad, of course, were the bombers, the missiles on the ground, and then the nuclear submarines with the missiles on board. The bombers were a big part of that triad, and then the B-1 was coming online to be part of the triad also. So I don't remember the exact number, but every base as they built up had 4 or 5 B-1s on, maybe 6 on alert. And a couple of tankers to go with them. At Ellsworth, we had 4 or 5 B-1s on alert. We had a couple of tankers, 3, I think, tankers on alert. Then we had EC-135 on alert also. The EC-135 was the airborne command post that the Strategic Air Command had all the time, airborne all the time out of Offutt Air Force Base. But we had one at Ellsworth also as a backup. So if anything happened to the primary, we could launch the backup. But that backup airplane also could launch all the missiles from the missile fields. So think about this now. The B-1 had 3 bomb bays. We usually had a fuel cell in the middle bomb bay. So you carried bombs in the forward bomb bay, in the aft bomb bay, usually SRAMs up front, which was the short-range attack missile, which would go in, and that's how you fought your way into an area. They would go out after defenses, and then you had 8 bombs that you dropped in the back bomb bay. So you take 28 B-1s and multiply that by 16 nuclear weapons per B-1, you come up with like 488, a little under, and then you take all the missiles that were in the ground, in the missile wing out there. When we generated Ellsworth Air Force Base, we became the 4th largest nuclear power in the world, behind the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain, and Europe. We were the 4th largest nuclear power. I mean, it was just amazing, the firepower we had at Ellsworth Air Force Base.
A tremendous amount of responsibility that goes with that too.
Right.
These are weapons that are, obviously incredibly impactful on the battlefield, and something we don't want to ever use unless we really have to use it.
And we would practice loading the nuclear weapons on. I remember one instance, which, and this is how serious it all was. We had dummy weapons and we had real nuclear weapons in the weapon storage area. Well, we were doing a in-house generation, meaning we were just generating ourselves. We're going to bring 28 B-1s up, a bunch of tankers, our EC-135s. We were going to generate them all. We were loading the dummy bombs on, and maintenance dropped one. And I was sitting with the wing commander in his vehicle, and I was the director for operations, and a dummy bomb hit the ground and just kind of rolled around a little bit. And we looked at each other. We stopped the generation. We got back to the command post where you have your wing staff has to be in the command post during the generation in case something goes wrong. And we sat down and we decided what to do. We downloaded all the airplanes and we reloaded the airplanes with real weapons because we felt that the ground crews were getting a little bit lackadaisical with the dummy weapons. So we did what we considered was the right thing. And not a problem. Everything was exactly right. Went exactly well, yeah.
What a great philosophy, because I'll be honest, when you were telling that story, my brain was jumping ahead and I thought, oh yeah, we're gonna cancel it, we're gonna be done with this for the day. No. Instead the response was, no, this is serious, and we're gonna take a quick operational pause, but we're gonna come back and do it right with the real thing.
Right.
What an attitude. That's wonderful.
Right. And people don't realize generations on bases back in those days in the Strategic Air Command. When you generated, like for an ORI, an operational ready inspection, the inspectors would all come and you'd get in the command post, you'd start loading it up, and they would give you problems. You'd get handed a piece of paper that says, there are people with weapons trying to get in the back gate now, and there's a fight going on back there. And then you'd have to, while you're still generating, you would have to take care of that problem. There were different instances that would come up to get a successful generation. But when you were done, like at Rapid City, at Ellsworth, we would have our 28 B-1s generated, all with nuclear weapons. We'd have probably 10 tankers generated to refuel those B-1s, maybe more. We would have pretty much all of our EC-135s ready to go, all generated, ready to go. And then the commanding officer from the ORI team would say, okay, the generation is done. They would declare the generation over, and they would be giving you a grade and everything. And then your next mission was to fly off of alert. So now a big part of this was now you had to safely ungenerate the airplanes, take all the nuclear weapons off, get them back to the weapon storage area, then load up dummy bombs to go out in the target area and get your grade for dropping bombs. Yeah, it was really interesting.
Sounds very involved.
It was very involved, yeah, very involved. So the whole generation, ungeneration, and flying was about a week.
Wow.
So when it was over, you were tired. Your wing was tired. Everybody was worn out.
I bet. And I think one of the great strengths in this job as the DO, you can fly again, right? It's not like the SR where you can't fly the mission jet.
I was fully checked out in the B-1, the KC-135, and the EC-135.
Everything,
now, now, as a senior wing staff person, I was fully checked out with the pilot checkout. But I needed an IP to fly with. I was not combat ready.
Correct. But you still had that understanding of what it was like to fly the airplane.
Exactly.
What was it like to fly the B-1? It's so different from everything you've flown up to now, I think.
Yeah, the B-1 was, the first thing was the SR and the T-38 and all, they were round dials, the RF-4 round dials. The B-1 was vertical tapes. So that was the first thing I had to get used to, was flying an airplane with vertical tapes, which means that everything was moving up and down all the time. There still was in the middle of the cockpit, as I recall, some round dials that you could, in case the vertical tape stopped working. But I had to get used to that. It was a very modern cockpit. And by the way, it's just been upgraded again. Well, several years ago, but it's completely glass cockpit now with all the latest technologies in the cockpit. But the B-1, it had a lot of bad publicity when it first came online, but it was an extremely good airplane to fly. It had its problems, but we worked them out. We did a lot of the working out at Ellsworth and TASC because they were the first ones to fly them. Ellsworth, we were the first ones to go operational with them. So we had a lot to do. So it was pretty interesting. A couple of the fun things you get to do, like at Ellsworth when I was a DO, when you're bringing new airplanes online, you have to see if they're fully maintenance capable in different areas. So we took 4 or 5 B-1s and some tankers to Alaska, up north to Fairchild Air Force Base for cold weather operations. We brought maintenance people with us, not just our maintenance people, but contractors that built engines, put generators on engines, and kind of did those types of things. And we would go up there and sit, and we'd say, okay, put the contractor on here, and it's 10 below zero. Our maintenance people are in heavy coats and gloves and all. Can you change a generator on this airplane? Can you fix this airplane? And those were the tests that were done. So we did that up there. There's a name for that, and that's skipped my mind. But basically, it's to see if you can take care of an airplane in the environment where it might be flying. The next thing we did was we took the airplanes to Guam. I took 7 B-1s and 3 or 4 tankers to Guam for hot and humid weather operation to make sure that the water vapor evaporators were working properly and the air conditioning systems were working, which, by the way, they weren't. The very first time we closed the cockpit, it rained in the cockpit. I mean, water just came down, so we had to redo those systems. So dealing with the new weapon system is very interesting, very challenging, and very rewarding. Loved every second of that.
Could you talk about wing sweep on the jet? Because I know that's obviously something that's very unique, especially for an airplane that big. We think of maybe the Tomcat or, I don't know, a Tornado, smaller aircraft, but a B-1 is a massive, massive machine, and those wings move in flight. Could you talk a little bit about that? And
you controlled the movement. It wasn't like the F-14 where it's automatic. You controlled the movement back and forth. And same theory, the faster you go, the more you sweep the wings back, and as you're going forward slower, you move the wings forward. I'll tell you a funny story. When we were at Guam, we got to Guam, and what we didn't know was at TASC, I believe, one of the B-1s, when the pilots put the wings to go back to full forward position, it went overlock. So it went a little too far forward, just a little bit, but it went over the locking mechanism too far forward. So we had pretty much all 7 of our B-1s up flying, maybe 5 or 6, but we had 7 of them there, but most of them were flying, and I was flying in one of them, and we're flying along, and we're going out to the island. We're going to drop some bombs, and we're going to come back, and we got a call from the command post there at Guam, and it says, "We've got a call from TASC. You are to return to base And this is the exact call. It's funny. You are to return to base and don't touch anything. Well, don't touch anything is kind of, you're not sure what to make of that when you're flying an airplane. Don't touch anything. It's kind of scary, but we said, I was there as the DO, so I said, hey, this is Colonel Kinego, DO of the 28th Bomb Wing. I said, can you put us in touch with DIAS so we know kind of what don't touch anything means? And they said, yes, we'll put you in touch with the DIAS command post. They did, and what they meant was, if your wings aren't swept, just come back in and land and do. And we did, and all the airplanes were fine. But I just got a kick of that. Don't touch anything.
Yeah, I think the really
and we sat on the ground for about a week
gosh.
at Guam. And you try to keep all your maintenance and crew people going at a place like Guam for a week when you have nothing to do. Yeah, it was that was a challenge.
I bet it was.
Yeah. Luckily, everybody was good. We had nobody in trouble.
That's half the battle right there. I think really something very neat about the B-1, it kind of got you back to your roots, flying that RF-4 down low and fast. Did you do a lot of those missions in the B-1 where you were at low altitude and I'm going to say high speed? There's nothing high speed like the Blackbird, but what was it like returning to that type of flying?
Yeah, we did a lot of down low flying. One of the things we did in Guam, which was really good, and it really showed you how this airplane operated. We were going to a target to bomb. We were going to bomb it from 500 feet. So we went down to 500 feet, and there were four of us in this flight. We had a flight of four, and we said, okay, burners now. We all lit the burners, and we were supersonic in about a second. I mean, we went right through the Mach, right over the target, dropped the bombs, and then went subsonic again, and came back around and did some bombing. It was a very interesting airplane to fly. We had three settings for the terrain following radar. We had soft, medium, and hard ride. What that means is if you're flying along the terrain, soft ride, the airplane will start responding to a mountain quicker and you'll start slowly pull up. Medium, you get closer. Hard, you pull right into the mountain and then pull straight up. So we would do all three of them. But after a year or so of flying the B-1s, we stopped flying hard ride because we found out we were doing some damage to the airplane. Yeah, especially the backbone of the airplane. Yeah, so we stopped flying hard ride. We demonstrated to a student or to a new pilot, and then they'd do that at DIAS, and then we'd stop doing it. But of course, they would do it if they were, heaven forbid, had to go into combat with it.
For sure. I think one of the big changes in that airframe and in that mission set occurred while you were there in terms of the nuclear mission. Hoping maybe you could talk about that, the transition that occurred.
Well, it was still nuclear when I was there at Ellsworth, but we were starting to develop conventional bombing techniques with the B-1. Now, I will tell you, it was kind of interesting. The B-1 had some flaws in the bombing system, so it was considered to be inaccurate. But our guys at at Ellsworth Air Force Base, the navigating people, especially the bomb nav people, figured out exactly what was going on. So one of our bombing missions for an operational readiness inspection, I was scared to death as the director for operations because the ORI team chief would not tell me what was going on. I asked how we did, and they said we're still compiling the scores, and they were going back and forth, meeting with each other. Then they were meeting with the wing commander, but they wouldn't tell me anything. I went over to the squadron to sit with the squadron commanders because they were pretty much terrified at this point. We were all trying to figure out what the heck is going on that nobody will tell us what's happening. And finally, when they told us, it turns out that we had the best bombing in the history of the Strategic Air Command, and they couldn't believe it was that good. And they just wanted to confirm it and reconfirm it and then reconfirm it before they actually said anything about it. And that's what it was. And that was the year we also went on. Every year, SAC had a bombing and navigation competition, and Ellsworth actually won that competition that year too for the best bomb wing.
I'll bet that's an immense feeling of pride because, like, yeah, okay, sure, you won an award, but what that really means is that pride that your peers, I mean, they're going to see you and realize, man, if something real happens, if, as you mentioned, if the balloon goes up, you guys are going to get the call because you have demonstrated that skill in the airplane.
Yeah, but the guys are really really good, and you know when we won that. We realized that all the B-1 wings were going to bomb well. And there were 4 of them now. They were all going to bomb well. And probably had better bombing systems than the B-52 at that point. They were probably going to out them. So what we figured, the winning B-1 wing is going to be the wing that works the hardest with their tankers, because the tankers were part of it because it was a bomb nav competition. The tankers had to go out, do a nav run, gas up, be it the refueling, gas up the airplanes, and then return to base and all, and they had to be accurate. So we turned out that our tankers were the best. Our bombers were the best too, but our tankers were the best. So we ended up winning the whole thing. But that was the key, the tankers.
Okay, so after that great time in Ellsworth, where'd you go next?
I was very fortunate. I went to Ellsworth as the assistant director for operations. I made colonel, got promoted to the director for operations, and running the whole flying operations there. Then I became the vice commander at Ellsworth Air Force Base, or the 28th Bomb Wing. And then one day when I was sitting at home, I got a call from the command post, and they said, "Sir, the 15th Air Force Commander, 3-star general, wants to talk to you." And I said, "Wow, wonder what I did now." And he said, "Joe, I just wanted to tell you that you've been selected to go to Grand Forks Air Force Base and be the commander of the 319th Bomb Wing up there." So that's what my wife and I did. We packed up in November of 1990, I guess, and headed up to North Dakota, to the 319th Bomb Wing, where I took over as the wing commander up there. And that was just a real thrill to be the wing commander of a bomb wing. And I commanded the entire base up there. We had a bomb wing, a missile wing, millions and millions of dollars worth of equipment, billions actually, of equipment, and all the personnel on the base. The base commander was actually in my staff, so I had a colonel that ran the functions on the base, like the commissary and the BX and those types of things. The hospital and all fell under him. The hospital commander fell under me. All that, it was just time-consuming and a great job. And I found out as a wing commander now, you had to be very careful what you said, because I got on the base and I was riding around with a couple of members of my staff, and I said something about a couple of trees, and it was just because of my just the way I am. I just said, "Oh, that's weird why they're there," or something like that. And the next day, the trees came down, and I realized that I was in a position now where I had to be very careful about what I said, because you never know where it's going to lead.
That's so funny, man. Oh man, yeah. When you, what do they say? What my commander is interested in, I'm intrigued by. When the boss says something, that's something that the rest of us need to take to heart. So wow. You mentioned 1990, something pretty important in Air Force history. I think in the U.S. history happened in '91. What was it like in that time and space when a Desert Storm went on? Because obviously there was bombing that occurred, but as I recall, was the B-1 part of that mission set and going over to Desert Storm?
At that point, no. But there was later on. When I got to it was really kind of funny, to Grand Forks Air Force Base as the wing commander. My entire hospital deployed to Desert Storm, so we got basically a MASH unit in of Guard, reserves, everybody just came to our hospital. Our military police deployed with our dogs and everything. We had other units deploy. We had a tanker squadron deploy. Our B-1s were all there. They all stayed there while I was there. They were all still there, but a good part of our base deployed, and we picked up other people to the point where I laughed because it got a little bit interesting when our hospital came home. The doctors, nurses, corpsmen, techs that were there, and they didn't want to leave. They were having such a good time being back on kind of active duty at the hospital. They didn't want to go home. So we had at one point we had twice as many people at our hospital that we were supposed to have until we could get people to actually leave. But my wife and I spent a lot of time on the flight line at Grand Forks, as we did at Ellsworth Air Force Base, though, too, meeting people coming back from Desert Storm, meeting dogs. We met dogs out there when the dogs would come back from the security police, meeting our squadrons coming back. We had what we call band in a can at both places where we were playing military songs and all as they got off their airplanes coming back from Desert Storm. So it was really quite interesting and really rewarding to be able to work with those people. Now, I myself, at that point, never deployed. I had to stay back with my troops because we still had all the nuclear weapons.
And let's be honest, I think you'd certainly earned that. You more than put in your dues in your time in the RF-4 and in the SR-71 doing those deployments. Okay, Joe, so again, talking through your career, there's been a lot of very historic things that have happened at different points that you were in leadership. Certainly a very important one happened in 1991. Hoping maybe you could talk us through that. Okay.
Yeah, probably the most significant thing that happened for me, based on the way my life was the way I was brought up with, as I said in the beginning, with the Russians and the Cold War and Vietnam, was the ending of the Cold War. I was the wing commander at Grand Forks Air Force Base when the Cold War ended. People often say, and it's kind of funny, when did the Cold War end? And everybody's got a little different answer. When the Cold War ended, when the wall came down, or whatever happened, the Cold War must have ended. Well, in the Strategic Air Command, it's very specific. It was the 28th of September, 1991, when a message came out from the Strategic Air Command, from the Commander-in-Chief, basically saying that we need to take all the bombers, all the tankers, and all the missiles off alert on this date. And the Commander-in-Chief of the Strategic Air Command actually came on the television screen in the command post where we were all told to go and said, as of, and this was a Saturday morning, he said, as of this moment, all single integrated operations plan, all PSYOP work is done. The Cold War is over. We need to take all the bombers off alert. So download all the bombs, take all the missiles off alert for now, and we're going off alert. And do it as safely as possible, but have it done by sundown Sunday night. This was Saturday morning. Well, we had it done by sundown Saturday night. We put the crews back in the alert facility. Had them spend their last night there, but they weren't on PSYOP alert, if you will. The next morning, which was Sunday morning, we brought the news people out from town. We had all of our civilian dignitaries come out to the alert facility. We had the families all come out to the alert facility. The crews had worked up a burial, if you will. They buried SAC Alert. They had a casket and all for SAC Alert. They dug a hole. They buried SAC Alert, and we did that. Had some fun with that, and then we put the crews back in the alert facility. We put all the families and the newspaper people and all our VIPs from the civilian community off to the side. I got in my DO car, my wing commander car rather, and I gave the command post the signal to blow the klaxon. The klaxon signals get to the airplanes and taxi. Well, the klaxon went off. The crews came busting out of the alert facilities, cranked up the B-1s, cranked up the tankers, and we taxied the airplanes off alert like we were going into PSYOP combat, and put them back on the bombing facility. We were ecstatic. That was a Sunday morning. Come Monday morning, I had my wing stand up where I had all my staff in, and we sat around that table and we said, well, what do you think we're going to do now? Now what do we do? That was our mission, being on alert, and that mission had just ended.
And the Air Force changed after that because, like you said, that was such a presence, such a enduring presence since the very beginnings of the Cold War, that nuclear alert mission. And now it was no more.
It was no more. And the B-1s more rapidly became tactically oriented and came off with a nuclear mission, PSYOP. So it was a big change. But taking the B-1s off of alert at Grand Forks Air Force Base, the 319th Bomb Wing, was probably maybe one of the most significant events in my life, because my life was I was brought up under that auspices of the Cold War.
I think that's something that people take for granted now. We don't really think of there's folks on subs, in silos, standing alert, and there are, but it's just not something that's in the conscious. And like you said, for you, it was your life, and then it changed.
Yeah.
Joe, how many hours, just a ballpark number, how many hours do you have in the air flying?
Probably between 4,600 and 4,700.
And a lot of them going very, very fast, very, very low, doing important missions in Air Force airplanes. What's the most important lesson you think you've learned as an aviator across that flying?
Well, that's a great question. And what I tell people, going back to a previous question, under greatest success, work hard, try to be the best, be a team player. But I would say, if I were to give advice to anyone, I would tell people in the service especially that the uniform comes first. That comes ahead of the badge you're wearing, whether it's a pilot badge, a navigator badge, a BN badge in the Navy, a missileer badge. It's the uniform that comes first, and the integrity. Do the right thing. Make your service proud of you. Pick up people along the way as you can to inspire them as to go forward. Just be as good a leader as you can be. And by doing all those things, you're going to make the service better. You're going to make yourself better. And I think you're going to make your career better along the way. And I would say that for me, that was the biggest lesson and the thing I would like to pass on to others.
Would you have done anything differently looking back at your career of flying? You've got to have flown, like I said, I think the most legendary airplane I can think of, the SR-71. You have seen so much, so many important things. But by the same token, I don't know about you, I occasionally will look back and think, man, what if I'd done this instead of that, or said this instead of that? Is there anything you look back on in your career, not like you said, not just as an aviator, but as an officer as well, that you wish you could have done differently, or maybe the road not traveled?
There really isn't. I look back at my career and I thought it was great. I enjoyed what I was doing. I liked the men and women I was working with. I just enjoyed the leadership challenges along the way, like the spy, getting the airplanes off alert, having SAC operational readiness inspections, all those things. Although at the moment they kind of feel like they're a pain in the neck, but when you look back on them, they were great leadership challenges and they helped you grow. I think I mentioned this, I had 2 opportunities to leave the Air Force, once right after Vietnam and once in the mid-'80s when the airlines were hiring. They were actually coming to the bases and recruiting right on the bases. And I both times chose not to do that. I chose to stay involved with the military and stay with the people I was just enjoying being with. And I think those were great decisions. I don't look back on them and say, boy, I wish I had been an airline pilot, or I wish I had been something else. I just very much like exactly what I did.
That's wonderful. One of the things you did and you still do is share your love of aviation with others. First at the Udvar Hazy Center, and I know you're obviously now at the National Museum of Naval Aviation here in Pensacola, and you help folks understand some of those wonderful airplanes that are in the museum. Could you tell me a little bit about what you've done at both museums?
Well, yeah. The Udvar Hazy Center, it's in Chantilly, Virginia, and it's part of the National Air and Space Museum. It's under the National Air and Space Museum has their big building on the Mall in Washington, D.C., and then they've got the Udvar Hazy Center, which is more like a giant hangar. It's a great facility out by Dulles Airport. When I retired from the Air Force, I went to work for a company, and I did that for 17 years. And when I retired from the company, I still wanted to stay active, and I really wanted to stay active in aviation. So I decided to go interview to be a docent, a tour guide at the at the Air and Space Museum. I did that. Believe it or not, the training is 6 months long. 6 months long. Every other Saturday, 8 hours a day to get trained to do that. And I did all that, got trained and became a docent at the Udvar Hazy Center. I thoroughly enjoyed doing that. We did private groups, special groups. I did a movie for Montgomery College there, a video for a veterans program that they were having. Thoroughly enjoyed everything we did there at the Udvar Hazy Center. Did that for about 6 years, and then my wife and I moved down here to the Gulf Coast, to the Pensacola area. And when we got here, I looked at the Armament Museum over by Eglin Air Force Base, and we went over there and visited. And then I just kind of decided I think this would be more what I wanted to do, be a docent at the National Naval Aviation Museum. Because there was more really for docents to do, I thought. So I went and I asked if they would take an Air Force guy to be a docent at the Naval Museum. I had 6 years of background. A lot of that was with Navy aviation, and I could learn the rest. And they said, sure. Go through training, and we'll make you a docent. So there was already one Air Force guy that was here. I became the second, as I remember, docent. That was about 6 years ago. Went through the training, and I've been doing this now for about 6 years, and I absolutely love it. I love working with the civilian population that comes on board. I also enjoy going out. I go out and I do a lot of talks to veterans groups and school ROTC groups and things like that, which I very much enjoy doing. I just like to stay active in the aviation world.
That's so wonderful. It's so great to share those stories because, again, I've read about some of the things that you've talked about today in books. And it's, I'm sure, that some SR-71 pilot did that cool thing. And today I'm honored to sit across the table from the person that did some of those things. I can't tell you how wonderful it is to hear it from someone like you. So thank you for, and that's kind of the way I wrap up all these, but thank you so very much for spending so much of your time here with me today. But thank you for also continuing to share that because it's really, really special for those of us. I never saw a Blackbird fly. There's a lot of aviation history I look back on, and it's only in a book. It's only maybe on a video on YouTube now. But you sharing that with folks, first person is just so incredibly wonderful. So thank you for doing it. For those that don't get to see behind the curtain here, not only do you have extensive notes that you've taken, you've brought so much information to share with all of us. I can't say thank you enough for taking the time, for sharing your stories. It sounds silly. It is truly inspirational. Like the story that you mentioned, your first combat mission flying over the Hanoi Hilton. I know folks that were on the ground that heard those, and again, when they speak about it, it was always with a reverence, just a hushed tone of no one that they didn't forget us. There were people overhead that continued thinking about us, and then now I'm sitting across the table from someone that did that. I don't know. It's incredibly meaningful and impactful to someone like me, and I know so many other people. So I just want to say again, thank you so much for sharing your stories. Thank you so much for an incredible career and telling us about it today.
Well, it was my pleasure to be here, and I do love to share aviation stories, and it's fun for me to do that. And it's fun to educate people who have not been around during the Cold War or Vietnam. And I try to do that at the museum also. Try to let people know, what has gone on, how we got where we are right now. So I enjoyed it. Thank you for doing this.